Okay, so we're just, like I said, we're just going to do some of the same things that we were doing last time. So first, I wanted to ask you about your nickname, because you were telling me after dinner.
Yes, my nickname was Punjab.
Why?
Why? Because when I was growing up, I was scrawny, so that my head was so much larger than the rest of my body, and this led people to name me after the comic character, the cartoon character Punjab in Little Orphan Annie, who was Indian with a big turban and a big head, and that's the reason why I was called Punjab.
Mm-hmm.
And many people remember me as Punjab.
Okay, so what was something else I wanted to ask you about? Okay, this is kind of jumping all over the place, but I also wanted to ask you about kind of some of your hobbies that you do now.
Well, right now, I spend most of my time with the stock markets, the financial markets.
And how did you become interested in those? In the stocks?
Well, I, subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and read the financial pages of the Times, and
Were you always interested in the stock market?
I guess I always was, even from the time I was in high school.
Oh, really?
Yes, looking at the stock quotations. Yeah. Yeah.
What else?
What else do I do? Well, I guess I do just a little reading for leisure, and again, primarily contact in connection with individuals and their lifetime histories and so forth. Yeah. I do not read much in the way of novels or.
My dad also likes to read biographies.
Yeah. And then I enjoy gardening. That is primarily Cymbidium orchids. And?
Do you want us to talk a little bit about your orchids?
Well, I guess I told you how I got started in orchids. Did I? No. Well, I was in a nursery when I saw a Cymbidium orchid, and I did not know that there were Cymbidium orchids, but it was simply an orchid with about 15 flowers. And I remember that in the late 1940s, when I was in high school, I would go to a dance and I would purchase an orchid for $8, which was a lot of money in the late 1940s.
Yeah.
So here I was at the Armstrong Nurseries, and I saw a plant with 15 flowers, and I thought to myself, wow, at $8 a piece way back then, that was a fortune.
Yeah.
And so for the first time in my life, I spent $20 for a plant. And as I was carrying the orchid home to the car, a lady said, "Why do you buy your Cymbidiums here?" I did not know that I had purchased a Cymbidium orchid, but I learned that it was a Cymbidium. So I went to the web, and then I found that Cymbidium orchids grow from Santa Barbara to San Diego, and maybe 10 miles inland. And I thought, but I'm 50 miles inland, and the orchids did terribly.
Yeah.
Because of the difference in temperature from the seacoast. And so I said, okay, I think I will fool the flowers to think that they not in a desert, but they're in the coast. And so I got my water hose, and I went splash, splash, splash. And of all things, the orchids really loved it. Yeah. And in fact, later when I went to a talk given by experts, I saw that, I asked a question. I said, after they had told me that During the winter, you water your orchids for maybe once a week and no more.
Uh-huh.
So I raised my hand and I said, I have a question, and that is, I've been watering my orchids for over 200 times a day. They all looked at me and they said, what? That's impossible. I said, oh, maybe more, because it had been raining, stop, and it would rain again continuously during the day. So, and I found that the orchids just loved water.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, eventually I found that, people, even the experts are watering their orchids more often.
Oh, really?
Than I, yeah.
And then you
So-
got into breeding them?
Oh, yes, I learned how to, pollinate the orchids and then breeding the orchids, yeah, right. And in fact, I didn't know anything about the orchids. And I remember going to a show once, and I just could not understand why different varieties with the same name, John Wooden. And I said, well, to my friend, I said, I just do not understand why John Wooden Fast Break, and here's another one, Walt Hazard, and on and on. And so my friend said, what's the matter with you? Don't you realize, or don't you know about the birds and the bees? And then I said, oh, yes. You could have the same parents.
Yeah.
And all the kids could be different.
Yeah.
And so then I started, whenever I went to public places, such as, Disneyland, and I'm just amazed that there are thousands and thousands of people, no two look alike.
Yeah.
And then I realized that even cows don't look alike. Or I thought that, I thought the farmers would name Bessie and Betsy, and,
Yeah.
that they were all different. You could have the same parents, but the kids would, just be more likely to be different. And I remember even before then, I would go to orchid shows, and I try to make a list of the labels on and I said, oh, how foolish, because unless I got the same orchid, which had been what we call cloned, I could not get the same good-looking one. And so I then made it a habit that whenever I go to orchid shows, I would look at find the most attractive young lady who is doing that, and I would go up to the lady and say, hey, when I first started growing orchids, I did exactly what you're doing. And she said, what do you mean by that? I said, oh, well, supposing I ask you, who are your parents? And, then she said, why? Because I want to get someone just like you. And she said, that's impossible. I said, oh, yes, it's possible if I were able to take little pieces of you and clone it. So anyway, that's what I learned about birds and bees, and that unless you, what they call Murray cloned it, you would not be able to get the same orchid.
Yeah.
So I learned that the way the people got, the nursery people who got all yellows or all reds or whatever, they cloned it. But so the cloning process involves taking little pieces of the orchid, put it into growth medium, and then you'd all wind up with blues, or not blues. Blues are difficult to get in orchids, but the same color.
Yeah. And do you clone orchids or you breed them?
No, I just breed them. Yeah. And I guess I told you that my my prized cloning or breeding process, I got to, after you grow the orchid, you take pollen from one plant and put it into the pod of the other, and 9 months later it matures so that you get a bean. Then you typically what I do is to send it to a laboratory, and then maybe a year or two later they will provide me with a tube with many small plants. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And then if you get it to bloom, you can register it with the Royal Horticultural Society in England. And what you need to do is provide them with a photo and a description of the orchid. And, then, and of course you could then select a name. Now what I did is I had hybridized an orchid like that, and I named one of my orchids as Cymbidium LA School. Cymbidium LA School. And if you go to Google and put in Cymbidium LA School, you'll find originator M. Kubota. Okay? So that's my claim to fame. And then if you, Google LA School, you find that it is one of the oldest schools west of the Mississippi. And you might say, well, how could it be? Well, it turns out that the missionaries found it easier sailing around South America up to Hawaii and then, establishing schools compared to the pioneers who had to cross the Rockies. And in fact, whenever I fly over the Rockies, I look down and I say, oh yes, I can see how difficult it would have been, crossing the Rockies as compared to sailing around South America. Besides, you won't have to worry about the Indians attacking you or whatever. Well, anyway, Cymbidium LL School originated M. Kubota. Then the second one that I hybridized is called Cymbidium Waimea High School. And now, again, you do the same thing with Google and you'll find Kubota, M. Kubota, originator. So that's two of my greatest achievements that I'm down for posterity. But then also, if you Google Waimea High School, you find that it is the westernmost high school in the U.S. And so I remember that for 4 years, at the end of the day, the students had to all stand at attention as the bugle played taps and the flag was lowered because the sun set last on Waimea High School. Yeah.
So what laboratory do you send the pods to?
Oh, the pods were sent to various nurseries or people who specialize in taking the seeds and put it into special growth medium. Now, in nature, that the pods could develop by themselves, but it required certain conditions. But more appropriately, by sending it to a laboratory, they had certain formulas that could, or certain number of compounds that could be used to cause them to grow.
Do you think that your background in science helped you in the process of breeding orchids?
Not very much. Not very much. I listened to, people and how the process occurred, and in fact, I even learned from a person who's called Harvey Chun, and he was known to. He was from Hawaii, and he had hybridized orchids. So he showed me how to, take the pollen from one plant to another, and then develop it. So I learned from him, and in fact, I hybridized an orchid called Harvey Chun, and Harvey graduated from Iolani High School. But he unfortunately passed away, and so what happened is I acquired a fair number of orchids from his greenhouse. Okay.
And then, so you mentioned, did he pass away recently? Did Harvey Chun pass away recently?
No, it must have been 15 years ago.
Okay. Because recently you've been going to a lot of memorial services.
Oh, yes. During the past month or so, at the church services, they would ask, are there any concerns, or people would say that they have a friend who is ill, a relative who would need prayers. And so for 4 consecutive weeks, I stood up and asked for prayers for the family of, Helen Kageyama or so forth, you see.
Yeah.
And then, people said, are your friends all dying because you've done this for 4 consecutive weeks? And I'm of an age where, 84, when so many of my friends are dying. And in fact, that is one of the things I do every morning, and look at the death notices in the Star Advertiser. In Honolulu, in Hawaii, they publish every day the death notices of every person that dies, contrary to the local papers here, where they have family paid obituaries, whereas and it would cost me $400, $500 to put an obituary in a paper, whereas in Hawaii, in Honolulu, the death notices of every person would come out in the paper. And so every morning, that's one of the first things I do, who had died.
Yeah.
And they'd be well, you can imagine, it gives me the feeling that, death is natural. That is, right now, most people are dying in the 80s or 90s, and, and occasionally you have somebody who's 100, 105, and, so, well, and whenever I see someone who is familiar, I would send off the notice to friends, or classmates, and that's one way I keep up with my friends. Well, one noteworthy occasion was one of our friends passed away. She had cancer for over 40 years, as I know, and then so we went to her memorial service on a Wednesday about 4 weeks ago, and noticed that she had a memorial service, and we went to the service, and then her name was Regina Velarde, Gina Velarde, and we went to the service, and the husband, Tony Velarde, Anthony Tony Velarde, carried the ashes of Gina down the aisle in a Roman Catholic ceremony, and a week went by, and then Tony, who had been a picture of health, suddenly died, So here was Gina, who had fought cancer for several years, passed away, and Tony was a picture of health, then died a week later. Rather tragic. And Tony was scheduled to be the auctioneer at one of our Cymbidium Club meetings. He's scheduled to be a speaker in April, and here he passed away. Yeah. So, and it turns out, talking about people dying, almost all of my classmates in graduate school passed away. So I feel as if I'm just plain lucky to be alive. Yeah.
Well, also I wanted to ask, because I know you went to a memorial service yesterday.
Yeah.
And they had hula dancing, right? Hula dancing.
Oh yes, yeah.
And the beautiful flower arrangements. And stuff.
Right. Well, apparently the person who passed away had many friends, and they seemed to enjoy occasions like dancing, and so it's not very usual to have you might say hula dancing, but this is what happened after it was a Buddhist service, and there I was I wasn't very close to the person who died, but Jane was, and so. Um, well, after the service, there was a reception, and at the reception, well, there was some entertainment, which I thought was unusual also, because usually there isn't anything like this. The service, one thing is, in fact, makes me feel that I wouldn't want to have a memorial service, because then they would typically ask the children and the grandchildren, talk about the grand times they had with grandma.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, I wouldn't want to have any,
Yeah.
we didn't have that many grand times together.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. But, it just gave me made me feel that some of the grandkids, were in tears, and
Yeah.
but they really wanted to say something about grandma. But well,
know.
that's the way it is.
No, I know. Well, the reason why I asked is because it seems like you have a lot of friends who are Japanese American,
Yes,
right? And so you're all often and a lot of Japanese Americans at your church, and so you're often attending Japanese American events.
Yes.
But you also live in the town where you live, Claremont.
Yes.
Doesn't have a lot of Japanese Americans.
No, in Claremont there, as I told you before, there are very few Asians.
Yeah.
In fact, the reason I quit going to the church that your dad and your auntie was, they went to the congregational church. But I used to go with them, and the people were always so nice, and they would come up to me and say, "Welcome to our country," and and I'd say, "But I've been here for 15 years or 20 years, and you're telling me welcome." So, but now we go to the church that my daughter goes, and it turns out that so many of the people at the church have more or less the same background as we do, that is growing up in coming from Hawaii.
Uh-huh.
Or in the case of the mainland Japanese, they've been going there for many years, and so there's more of a feeling of being part of a family, as contrasted to being, alone in a in a church where there are very few Japanese.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because it seems like you've maintained this big Japanese American friend group and network.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes you go a little farther outside of Claremont to
and so
maintain
typically, well, in fact, I guess you may have heard that when people from Hawaii get together or meet for the first time, the first question is, which island are you from? And then they may say Maui. Oh, which high school did you go to? And then the third question invariably is, what year did you graduate? And of course the fourth response that you don't say is, boy, you look pretty good for your age. But then another thing that is very funny is you say, we went to a high school with about 140 graduates, and we knew all of our classmates. Okay, and as contrasted to coming from, say, a big high school in Honolulu, where they may have 700 or more. And so I would say, well, have you ever been to a high school reunion? And they say, oh, no, I have never been back because I don't remember any of my classmates.
Yeah.
And so I'd say, oh, let's see now, class of 1951, McKinley. So do you know, Harry Yamamoto? And this person would say, oh, yes, I know Harry. and then I'd say, how about Woody Yoshimoto? And it's amazing, then. And the third question would be, well, how about Myrtle Yoshioka? She's now, Yoshikane. And meanwhile, this person is thinking, how in the world would you know any of my classmates when I don't remember any of my classmates? Then I'd say, oh, yes, but I found out that in a big high school, they assign people to the homeroom according to the last names. So the Yoshikanis, Yamamotos, would all, for 3 years, from the 10th grade, 11th or 12th, go to the same homeroom. And every morning they'd call the roll. And so that's the only reason to remember the names of the people, is that for 3 years they had the same classmates. Well, anyway, that's meanwhile, that's the reason. One of the things that we always do is, even last night, yesterday at one of the memorial services, we sat at tables, where we met people, and then we said, isn't it amazing that, we know, I don't know whether Grandma told you about this person whose name is Light Matsumoto, okay? And then we said, oh, we know Light, and because he was a neighbor to Joyce, and right now it's Joyce Miyasato, but that Light was about 2 years older than Joyce, and he was a very good-looking guy, and he would always volunteer to take the trash out, because Joyce was the next-door neighbor, 2 years, very good-looking girl, because he always volunteered to take the trash out, hoping to see Joyce. And meanwhile, Joyce, would always look out to see Light. Well, it turned out that just yesterday we met Light's younger brother, whose name was Perry. Perry Matsumoto. It's very unusual to have names like Perry. Said, well, yeah, it was from Perry Como, the singer, and said Light. At first, we thought it was his name should have been Dwight, but no, it was just that the Matsumotos somehow had named their children, with different unusual names. Yeah, so. We make connections of this and we, it seems to us the world is so small that, we would find or meet people, and invariably it's by, asking what high school, and,
Yeah. Well, so this was something I was asking Grandma about a little bit, that since you came from a community that was so small where everyone kind of knew each other.
Yeah, well, our community was much smaller. New Mill, the sugar plantation
was much smaller.
But much smaller than Waimea. Waimea is a big city.
Right, exactly.
But still, nevertheless, the communities were small that we would, all names would become quite familiar. Okay?
Right, exactly.
So in our case, we must have had, maybe 50 Japanese families. And so we got to know all of them. And then there was what we call Portuguese, Puerto Rican, a Filipino camp. When we say camp, they all lived more or less in a certain part of the sugar plantation village.
Yeah. So because later in your life you went all over the U.S. and all over the world.
Right.
And so I was wondering, were you ever nervous or anything because you came from such a small place, then had such a global lifestyle?
Well, I won't call it nervous. It's just
or just different.
It was like part of going away from from the island to another.
Right.
But because this is something that. When I first came to the mainland, it was 2 weeks after I graduated from high school, or from college, that I was in the Army. I had to fly from Honolulu to the mainland, and I flew to Atlanta, Georgia, and then from Georgia I caught a bus to Columbus, Georgia.
Uh-huh.
And now I did not realize, for example, that in the South there was discrimination between the whites and the blacks.
Uh-huh.
And I went to the bus, and the bus was practically empty. But in my usual way, I walked to the back of the bus, and the driver stopped and said, "Hey, what are you trying to do?" I said, "What?" I did not know that I wasn't supposed to be in the back. That it was for the black people. Okay, and then later I discovered that at the Army post we had about 10. In our company, we had about 10 blacks, and the rest were whites. There were just 2 Asians. Okay. But I did not realize that whenever we went to this Columbus, which was about 15 miles away from Fort Benning, Georgia, that the black soldiers, friends, never came along with us. We went to restaurants, movie theaters, But while we went to the officers' club on post, we all got together. And then the other thing I didn't realize was that the white soldiers, especially from those on the South, really discriminated against the Jewish.
Oh, really?
And I didn't. In fact, I did not even know any Jewish people on the islands, and I did not know that Jews were being discriminated against. But it was an education for me.
Yeah.
In fact, talking about discriminating. This was about 2 years before Rosa Parks, decided to sit in the bus, and not give up her seat.
Right.
Yeah. But so here I was, saying, walking to the back of the bus and could not understand why.
Right. Yeah.
And the same thing happened when we went from Claremont, California, where we were in 1959. In 1966, we had a sabbatical, I had a sabbatical leave in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Uh-huh.
And I did not realize that there were special schools for the blacks. And what happened then is we said, "Oh, great! Just about 5 blocks from where we live, there's a nice new school." And so we went to the school district office, and the secretary said, "Well, this is where you live, and this is where you're going to school, about 8 miles away."
Yeah.
And we said, "Oh, well, there's a new school, just a few blocks away. Why not?" So, "Oh, because all your neighbors go to the school,
Uh-huh.
And so there was, you might say, discrimination understood,
Yeah.
And there, I guess Lynn had 1 or 2 black classmates, and she got to know them. I said, why is it that there aren't any other black students here?" He said, "Oh, if you come to the school, you have to wear good clothes." There was free choice. But nevertheless, things changed very rapidly, because about 2 or 3 years later, the mayor of the city elected was a black person. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But again, I did not realize that there was such racial discrimination.
Right. And so, since there was such racial tension, how did you and your family fit into that as Japanese American?
No, somehow we just were accepted as people with the whites.
Okay, so you're more.
We had friends. In fact, we had friends who were Jewish who lived in the same apartment complex, and other friends who were Canadians, and as Asians, we just became just accepted. We didn't feel any difference.
Yeah.
Although when in 1973, when we went to England, again we didn't feel any discrimination, except our son Keith was 10 years old, and some of the British kids were would call him Ching Chong Chinaman or something,
Yeah.
but he was fully accepted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, question. Oh yeah. So since you were mentioning that you were in the South just a few years before Rosa Parks, you were on the bus in the South just a few years before Rosa Parks.
Yeah.
And you were alive during World War II, so you've seen a lot throughout your lifetime.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts are and how the world has changed, or like all the
Oh,
historical things that have
undoubtedly
happened.
changed. In fact, you might say in Hawaii, I do not remember seeing any black people. And the only black that I knew was Little Black Sambo. Have you seen that? There was a book for children, and so there was a black child who was called Little Black Sambo, and he was in a jungle, and so he was perhaps the only black person that I remember. Okay, although I do remember. This must have been about 1943, 44 or so, that we went to the beach with the kids. Some of my friends went, and there was a troop transport, a big ship that came by, and they came close to to our beach, and they lowered some boats, and the soldiers were allowed to swim.
Uh-huh.
And it turned out that this was a completely segregated unit with all black soldiers.
Oh, wow.
And so the first blacks, you might say, that I saw were hundreds of blacks, swimming nude. Of course, that was quite an experience that I can never forget,
Yeah.
So again, that was maybe the only example of seeing, black people.
Mm-hmm.
And that reminds me of, racial relationships between in Hawaii.
Uh-huh.
We were in Leningrad at a meeting, and then we were riding a bus that is some friends from New Jersey. Okay, well, we were riding a bus, and my friends were asking, Mitz, how are race relationships in Hawaii? And I said, well, it's always been, whoever came last was at the bottom of the totem pole.
Uh-huh.
So I said that when we were growing up, the last people to come were from the Philippines. And so our parents would say, to my sister, who was 2 years older, behave, or otherwise you'll wind up with a, Filipino boyfriend or husband or whatever. And so there I was saying, the question was how are race relationship in Hawaii? Because they were in Hawaii, and they saw a young couple, discussing what would your parents say about our going together.
Uh-huh.
And so, our friends Steve and Jane Ittel, I-T-E-L, from New Jersey, said, well, how a race relationship? And we assumed no one in the bus could understand English because it was all Russian speaking.
Yeah.
And of all things, there was a person who was obviously a mixed racial relationship, and so this young lady comes sitting next to me saying, "Aloha," and we were, completely embarrassed because we assumed no one could understand what we're saying and talking about,
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was an experience I can never forget
Yeah.
about racial relationships.
And then also just all of the big historical events like World War II, the Cold War,
Yeah,
everything that happened over your lifetime.
yeah.
Like when you look back, are you kind of shocked sometimes or not shocked, but isn't it interesting to think about all the things that have happened?
Well, right now I'm really concerned about financial difficulties that people are having. Because you read in paper about the problems that disadvantaged people, especially blacks, have with respect to not being able to overcome the financial difficulties that the depression. Well, it was really. The events of the 2007, when the housing market, really fell apart, and how I feel so sorry for these people who were, who had to, you might say, refinance their homes, and it got to a point where they would, they wound up being homeless because even with their both parents still working and having served in the military, but because of the circumstances in which they had paid for houses, and eventually with the housing crisis, the price of housing, getting depressed, and the payments that the people have to make, and they would wind up, owning they just would not be able to make ends meet, and winding up being homeless. I think it's so unfortunate.
Yeah, and how kind of a lot of events have led.
Yeah, and on the other hand, I feel, well, I somehow have always been so frugal, and and what happened is again in 2007 when everything was, the housing crisis came, where people were finding that they could not make their payments. Okay. And it's a very tragic situation right now. More and more people are being unable to meet, their finances, their financial obligations. I think it's something it just saddens me.
Yeah.
But in my case, I was just extremely lucky,
Yeah.
In 2007, it was at a time when I said, well, why don't I just take my money out of the savings and loans and put it in the stock market. And so I got into the stock market when things were rather drastic, you might say.
Yeah.
But then since then I found that everything just rose, and
Right.
so I was just plain lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I also wanted to ask you about being a professor.
Yeah.
And how kind of your job changed, like the opportunities that you had,
Yeah,
like especially
okay.
to travel and your connections with people
okay.
around the world
Yeah.
and stuff.
Well, I told you how lucky I was in that, and for me, the fortune, I guess, would have been that I developed friends, by pure accident. And I guess it was in 1970 when I went to a meeting, and I had an old professor, who just adored me. And he would say, "Oh, hi, Mitzi. How are things there in California?" And I was telling him about, that he was chatting with me. He was the president of the Chemical Society, but he was such a big guy, and we were in a bus, and a school bus.
Yeah.
And so naturally, John Baylor, who was president of the American Chemical Society, who was one of my professors, he started talking to me, and I did not realize that right behind us was this person who was a former student of John Baylor, okay? And so he was thinking, gee, I wonder why Baylor. Well, it turned out that this person eventually became head of the National Science Foundation, my section, which dealt with my specialty.
Oh, okay.
And so he thought, I guess we were at a meeting, and he offered me all sorts of things, such as we would have, we were at a lobster roast, and he said, "Oh, you should have been with me, because there are so many people who just said that they didn't like lobster." And then, well, his name was Orrin Williams. Orrin said, "Well, Mitz, why weren't you in Melbourne?" And I said, "Well, I'm from a small college." And he said, "Have you ever applied?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, that's your problem. If you don't apply, you will never get grants."
Yeah.
So next time I was in Washington, D.C., I went to his office, and I said, where's the next big meeting? He said, "In Poland." Okay, so I said, well, he said, "Here are the papers, just apply," And within a week, he calls me on the phone, and he says, "Do you have a passport?" A passport? Never heard of a passport. And very shortly, I was on my way to Poland, at a meeting. And ever since, at many other occasions, I would have phone call from Orrin Williams. He always thought that because because he thought that his PhD advisor like me, then I must be something. And so anyway, I wound up going to so many meetings, especially in Europe. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Meanwhile, the Europeans are thinking, this, Mits Kubota, he must be an important guy because he's at these meetings in Milan or,
Yeah.
So I was just plain lucky because of this chance, and I put it back to this chance bus ride from Kansas City to Lawrence, Kansas, in a yellow school bus with John Baylor, who chose to sit next to me because, it was the obvious place he should be, and to have Orrin Williams, who eventually became the head of the NSF section, who always, then put me at the list, top of the list.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was one occasion where he said, "Oh, this would, aren't you going to Leningrad?" I said, "Oh, I've been to Leningrad." And he would say, "Oh, but don't you want to renew your friendships with people there?" And I said, "Well, now it was January?" I said, "But the deadline for submission of abstract was January, was May." He said, "Oh, don't worry. Apply, put in your application right away, and you'll get there." He said because he said, "Shilov, if he's running the program, and if he doesn't get you, I'll get a hammer and sickle and go after him."
Oh, no.
So eventually, I wound up going to Leningrad, and again for the second time in 2 years, it turned out to be. Then I found out that the abstracts, the book of abstracts that came out, had my abstract on the back cover, not on the papers, but apparently they had printed it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So throughout my experience, I guess I was extremely lucky. And meanwhile, people from the big universities were thinking, how in the world is guy from a small college is able to go to meetings and Leningrad and Poland. Yep. So again, that's what I call luck.
Yeah. And in your professional life as a professor, what do you think was your favorite part? Was it the research or the travel or the friendships?
Well, again, I guess I must have been extremely lucky in getting funding for doing research, because in small colleges, in fact, in all universities, raising money for equipment and for your personnel comes about from writing research proposals to funding agencies. Okay, and I was able to get funding, and it turned out that, well, again, I must have been very lucky in always getting funding. On this, except in this one instance when I found that of all things I was rejected, and then I found out that there's a person on the committee that I didn't get along with.
Oh, really?
And so I said, well, in fact, what happened was that this person is well known, became an editor of a journal that of inorganic chemistry, and so I submitted a proposal which was rejected, and then I didn't change it, and I wrote back to the funding agency and I said, I'm submitting this proposal because I think one of your referees just didn't like me.
Yeah.
And so it was funded. And so I was extremely lucky in that regard. Having my proposals granted.
Yeah.
And as far as the my research, I was extremely lucky in getting students who wound up, doing exceedingly outstanding work. So one of the things I say now is like Jennifer Salem, Jennifer, who worked with me, and who is now a CEO of a company. One of the few instances where a young lady becomes the head of the company.
Yeah.
Or I had about 3 or 4 others who are fellows of the AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who are elected to be members by vote.
Yeah.
So these people are heads or at big universities like Ohio State and Caltech, UC San Diego, and so in fact people are somewhat surprised when they say, "Wow, these guys have worked with you," and I say extremely lucky because they just did very well.
Yeah.
One person in particular is Michael Saylor at UC San Diego, and he did some work with me, and he's very well known, but when he went to Northwestern and did some work, and he said, when he came to give a lecture at our place, I said, I looked up a paper that he wrote. I wrote the paper.
Yeah.
But he said that, in his second year in graduate school, things weren't going too well. And he said, out came this paper, and his fellow classmates said, Michael, you're famous. Because out came this paper of work that he had done as a sophomore, junior. And by the time he graduated, I finally got around to getting some other people to do some other measurements, and we got a paper out.
Yeah.
And so his classmates said, "You're so famous," you know.
Yeah.
As he said, that was my first paper, and in fact, I gave him a copy of it. He said, "Would you please sign it?" You know, and he had over 150 papers by then, but
Oh, wow.
never had seen
his first
or
one.
a copy of the first paper
Yeah.
that has his name as an author.
Yeah.
Just plain luck.
Yeah. So when you look back on your life, what do you think are some of your happiest memories?
Happiest
question,
is
yeah.
I would say looking at the achievements of my graduates,
Yeah.
and initially, when they were with me, I was not thought of highly by my colleagues. They just couldn't figure out how could I wind up with students. And I remember one in particular. Well, this is Michael Chan. Okay,
Uh-huh.
when when I was in Italy, my friends in Italy said, "Oh, this Michael Chan, son of a professor at Caltech, he's going to Harvard Mudd College." So I went back to the start of school year, looked at a roll, and I said, "Michael Chan, I just heard from friends in Italy that you're coming to Harvard Mudd College, and you're in my section for the first time." And so he did some work with me, and when he graduated from college, his parents, he invited me to a family, you might say, celebration. And his mother is a computer scientist working at a jet propulsion laboratory. Father is a well-known professor. He said, "Hey, Mitz, thanks to you, he is in chemistry." And in fact, I followed him through his career, and went to Berkeley to get his PhD, and did a postdoctoral fellowship at Caltech, and became a professor at Ohio State.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, just last month we were at a banquet, and was with the person who was his postdoctoral advisor. He said, "Oh, now," I said, "I wonder how Michael's doing." He said, "Oh, did you know that Michael's now at the University of Hong Kong?" So, but doing very, very well.
Yeah.
So I think I look back and at the achievement of my graduates that make me feel like, again, just plain lucky.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I wanted to ask about some of the traditions that were passed on to you that you hope to pass down to your children and grandchildren?
Traditions.
Or values, or...
The values, I I hate to say it, but I've told you before that I grew up as a depression child. Just can't waste. Oh, that's my watch. I don't know. It's.
Do you need to turn it off? Or does it just go?
It just rings. Or I don't know how to turn it off. But it's gone.
Yeah. Sorry,
But
what were you
I'd say that it's that somehow Grandma and I are depression kid, and so we always thought we could not waste anything. Yeah. And but then I feel as if we should pass on to you folks whatever we can.
Yeah.
And that's about all. Okay.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, except that I always feeling that, gee, I'm just plain lucky to be alive. Okay. And I look back and I say, yes. How can I? How is it that I'm still living? because so many of most of my friends, from high school, have already passed away, and now most of my friends from the undergraduate times are passing away.
Yeah.
Graduate school classmates, they all died. Okay, and so I'm saying, what is it that kept me alive? So. Yeah.
That's all?
Yeah. Well, so I feel that I'm beginning to fade.
No.
Oh yeah. So, well, anyway, that's about all I can tell you.
Okay.